While it's the least technically challenging part of the rendering process, perhaps no other component is going to play as great a role in the final outcome of our image as our composition. It's going to form the basis and the backbone for everything else that we do, so it's important that we consider it carefully. We'll do just that, coming right up. So why start here? Considering composition carefully is important for a few reasons, some of which are going to be relevant mostly to your audience, and some of which will be relevant to you. For your audience, a well-composed view will actually tell someone more about your project for two reasons. For one, it should cut out all the fluff and get right to the heart of what it is that you want to communicate about your project. And second, artfully composed images naturally make us want to look longer, deeper, and more thoughtfully at the work. It demands that we continue looking at it. Great imagery can be very seductive, and we should use this to our full advantage. And for you, the creator, carefully selecting our view helps us budget our time to maximum effect. If I know that I'm only going to be seeing a certain limited view or set of views, then I can concentrate my image-making efforts in those areas exclusively. The rendering process is already time-consuming enough as it is, so we need to be as efficient as we possibly can. Making composition a priority is a great first step to streamlining the process. So how do we know what a good composition is? Well, as designers, we have a pretty good litmus test. How well does this explain what my project is about? So as you're beginning to select your views, ask yourself first and foremost what story it is that you're trying to tell about this project. If you haven't got an answer for this, put this video on pause and go figure that out first and then come on back. Things are going to be a lot clearer after you answer that question. So now we need to ask ourselves what views tell this story or illustrate this concept most clearly. What do you include in the frame? What do you exclude, and how do you exclude it? What relationships between the elements in the frame can you bring out, and how do you leverage those relationships to further illustrate your story? At the most basic level, how do you tell a story with pictures? So while it might be a little unusual at first, sometimes it's helpful to think of making renderings as like taking a virtual photograph of an object or a space. And if we start thinking about it that way, it makes sense that the guidelines for photographic composition are going to be applicable to us, and there's certainly a lot that we can learn from them. So let's have a look at some of these principles in practice with some great examples of architecture and product design visualization. The path of the eye. Maybe the most fundamental consideration for the arrangement of the elements in your scene is how the viewer's eye is going to move through the image. We want to allow the eye to flow naturally through the image while remaining within it. All other compositional guidelines exist in service to this principle. How does someone's experience with your image unfold over time? No matter what other compositional techniques you're employing, this should always be at the forefront of your mind. Notice how your eye moves up the driveway, edged with the fallen leaves, and lands on the bright, glowing center of the image. In a way, it's giving you the same processional experience as you would approach the house in reality. Rule of thirds versus centered compositions.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
Did you really think you were going to get through an entire discussion of compositional technique without it? But instead of just saying, it's a rule, and moving on, let's think about it in relationship to our primary principle. In this gorgeous rendering of Henri Lebrousse National Library, a shaft of light strikes the bookshelf right at the third line intersection, and then the eye is allowed to follow the railing around and along the lines of the bookshelf into the depth of the image, pulling you further in. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, maybe the single most famous one-point perspective in all of architecture. The stillness of the materials, surrounding environment, the sound of the softly falling water, the perpetually cloudless horizon, they all contribute to the mood evoked by this perspective. The view alone evokes the contemplative nature of the space. In this product rendering, the use of contrasting color and the placement of the center of interest on intersecting third lines really adds to the dynamic composition in an otherwise monotonous field. So how do we retain as much of the three-dimensional quality of our work as we can while working in 2D? One approach is by really enhancing the sense of depth in the view. Having objects exist distinctly in the foreground, middle ground, and background really enhances the three-dimensional quality of work, allowing your viewer's eye to move into the depth of the image. In this rendering for an apartment in Stockholm, the foreground is framed by the palms, which then flows into the sequence of rooms that follows. Notice the use of light and dark here, connoting foreground, middle ground, background. This allows you to kind of walk through the rooms in your own mind. We can also use techniques like depth of field to suggest depth and scale in our images. Our eyes are so accustomed to seeing optical phenomena like blurry foregrounds and backgrounds as indicators of depth that when we include them in our image, the sense of three-dimensionality is really heightened. This becomes even more apparent when there's a big relative distance from the camera between objects in the frame. In this rendering of a calculator, depth of field contributes to the sense of scale, frames within the frame. This idea is a bit of an extension of the foreground, middle ground, background concept in that we recognize the edges of an object in the foreground that's closer to us than what's beyond, but now we're also seeing our view directed into the depth of the image. While maybe a little on the nose in this case, the use of the foreground framing element helps direct your view into the background and pulls you into the image, indicating the depth in this co-working space. Leading lines. Our eyes naturally tend to lock in on the major linear features within an image and follow them. And we can use this tendency to point our viewers' eyes in the direction that we'd like them to go. Vanishing lines in perspective views tend to have this effect. Think of that classic image of a desert highway receding seemingly infinitely into the horizon. Negative space. Sometimes the best thing to include in the frame is as little as possible. Including less in the frame is a way of focusing attention on what it is that's important. This can be hard to do sometimes in an architectural context when you're constantly surrounded by space, but play with different kinds of framing and see what you can come up with in order to sort of draw out particular views that really minimize what you're asking the viewer to focus on. In this rendering of the chair, for instance, notice how everything else recedes into total darkness. What we're left with really highlights the grain of the wood, the elegant bends, and the way that these parts of the chair all come to meet at a corner. The contrast between light and dark and the way the view is framed really focuses our attention straight into the background of the image, pulling us in and highlighting what the image maker wants us to see. And just one other thing I wanted to address, and that is sometimes when we're looking at the imagery that we have been here today, it's really easy to start getting discouraged and disheartened and feel like, oh my gosh, like those images are so fantastic, nothing I make looks like that, and I'm never gonna get there. My renderings don't look anything nearly that good. And I wanna say, first of all, that feeling is totally normal. We've all been there. I totally understand how you're feeling. But the thing that's important to keep in mind is that these images are simply composed of all of the same basic principles, just executed at a very high level. The people making these images don't have access to any tools that you don't have access to. They just happen to have been doing it for a much, much longer time, and they've developed a real taste and a sensibility for how to massage these different elements into place and really work them to their advantage. And I think when you begin to see it this way, it becomes a lot more palatable to kind of get through difficult times, to understand that these images aren't composed of magic. They're composed of these individual parts and pieces that have been fit together really nicely and really elegantly, and that the more you expose yourself to them, the more that you start to interrogate what it is that makes those images tick, the more that you can kind of deconstruct them and analyze them for yourself, and then apply that thinking in your own work. I think you're going to find that your results really start to improve. Well, that's about a wrap for everything on composition. Catch us in next week's video, and until then, happy rendering.